A castle that locks its bride outside on her wedding night is already colder than the winter itself. The words would not be spoken until much later, yet on that bitter evening they already lingered unseen above Blackthorn, Keep like a quiet promise waiting for daylight. Snow drifted across the towering fortress in slow white sheets, soft enough to appear peaceful, relentless enough to bury every footprint left behind. The celebration inside the castle had only just begun. Music floated through stained glass windows. Laughter echoed beneath ancient stone arches, and hundreds of candles painted the grand hall in warm shades of gold. Outside, however, Evelyn Carter stood alone before the enormous oak doors that had welcomed her only hours earlier as the newest Luna of the Northern Kingdom. She was still wearing the ivory wedding gown prepared for the royal ceremony, beautiful but hopelessly thin against the mountain cold. The ceremonial fur mantle promised to every royal bride had quietly disappeared before the feast began. One noblewoman had smiled politely and whispered that every future Luna must first prove she possessed the strength to endure the kingdom's harsh winters. No one questioned the explanation. No one offered another cloak. Then the doors had closed behind her with a heavy thud that echoed across the empty courtyard, leaving her surrounded by nothing except falling snow and the endless sound of the wind. Evelyn drew a slow breath, wrapping her arms around herself as icy air slipped through the delicate fabric of her dress. She glanced once toward the glowing windows where distant shadows moved across curtains, reminding her that an entire celebration continued only a few feet away. She could have knocked. She could have begged to be let inside. Instead, she lowered her eyes and whispered the words her mother had repeated throughout her childhood. Kindness is easiest when life is easy. The real measure of the heart begins when no one is watching. The memories settled gently inside her, steadier than the freezing wind. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, wolves called to one another through the pine forests blanketing the mountains. They're distant. Howls rolled across the valley before fading into the storm, strangely comforting instead of frightening. Evelyn had grown up believing that every creature searching through the darkness hoped for the same simple thing, a place where it belonged. She wondered if that hope was enough to carry someone through a night like this. Time slowly lost its meaning. Snow gathered across the stone steps, along the hem of her gown, and upon her pale hair until she looked almost like part of the winter landscape itself. Every breath became visible before disappearing into the night. She rubbed warmth back into her fingers, careful not to remove the simple wedding ring resting against her hand. Earlier that day, Alpha King Lucian Ashford had placed it there with calm respect before leaving unexpectedly to settle an urgent dispute along the northern border. They had exchanged only a handful of words, yet she remembered the quiet sincerity in his silver eyes. He had promised he would return before the night was over. Evelyn chose to believe him. Another gust swept through the courtyard, carrying with it something almost too soft to notice. At first she thought it was only the wind slipping beneath the hedges lining the castle walls. Then she heard it again, a faint, trembling whimper, fragile enough to disappear beneath the snowfall. Evelyn turned toward the sound without hesitation. Whatever waited in the darkness beyond the snow-covered hedge was frightened, alone, and calling for help. And even as the cold stole the feeling from her hands, she found herself taking one careful step forward, completely unaware that the choice she was about to make would quietly change not only her own destiny, but the future of an entire kingdom. The sound came again, carried between the restless gusts, so faint that another person might have mistaken it for nothing more than the wind weaving through the frozen hedges. Evelyn paused, listening carefully. There it was once more, a tiny cry filled with fear rather than pain. Without thinking about the cold settling deeper into her bones, she stepped away from the castle doors and followed the sound across nearly a foot of fresh snow. Each careful step left a shallow trail that disappeared almost as quickly as it formed beneath the continuing snowfall. Kneeling beside the hedge, she brushed away the powdery snow with trembling hands until a pair of frightened golden eyes blinked back at her. Curled beneath a fallen branch lay a tiny silver wolf pup, its soft fur dusted with frost, one small paw trapped beneath wood that had frozen solid against the ground. The little creature did not growl or retreat. It simply watched her with exhausted trust, as though it had already decided that this stranger was its last chance. Evelyn smiled gently despite the sting in her frozen cheeks. "Do not be afraid," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind itself. "You are not alone anymore." She carefully removed one glove, ignoring the sharp bite of icy air against her skin, and slowly lifted the branch just enough for the frightened pup to pull its tiny paw free. The little wolf stumbled forward before collapsing against her arm, too weak to remain standing. Without hesitation, Evelyn gathered it close beneath the folds of her gown, shielding its shivering body from the bitter wind with the only warmth she still possessed. The tiny creature released a soft sigh and rested its head against her heartbeat. She gently stroked the thick silver fur until its breathing began to slow. "There you are," she murmured. "You are safe now." Inside Blackthorn Keep, warmth and celebration continued without interruption. Long banquet tables overflowed with roasted meats, fresh bread, honey cakes, and steaming cider, while musicians played cheerful melodies beneath glittering chandeliers. Noble families laughed together as if the night were unfolding exactly as planned. Near the largest fireplace, Lady Vivian Blackwood lifted a crystal glass while several council members gathered around her. "The mountains shape strong rulers," she said with calm confidence. "A future Luna must learn that comfort is earned, never given." Several guests nodded politely. Others remained quiet, avoiding the large front windows where snow continued falling beyond the glass. At the edge of the hall, a young servant carrying fresh cedar logs slowed as he passed the entrance. He glanced toward the heavy oak doors, remembering the young bride standing outside only minutes earlier. He hesitated before reaching for the iron handle, but an older steward quietly caught his wrist. "Do not," the steward whispered. "The council gave strict instructions." "But she is alone," the young servant answered softly. The older man lowered his eyes. Sometimes good people obey rules they wish had never been spoken. Reluctantly, the young servant stepped away, though guilt lingered plainly across his face. Far above the courtyard, hidden within the western tower behind frost-covered windows, a solitary figure continued watching everything below. The observer had witnessed the closed doors, the untouched banquet, and now the quiet young bride kneeling in the snow, using the last of her own warmth to comfort a frightened creature that could offer nothing in return. The figure remained silent for a long moment before resting one weathered hand upon the cold stone beside the window. "Interesting," came a quiet voice barely above a whisper. "She chooses mercy before survival." Outside, Evelyn gently tucked the sleeping wolf closer beneath the folds of her gown as another wave of icy wind swept across the courtyard. She never noticed the watchful eyes above her, nor the faint silver shimmer that flickered for only an instant beneath the little wolf's fur before disappearing into the falling snow. The little wolf rested quietly against Evelyn's chest, its tiny heartbeat growing steadier beneath the layers of silk and snow. Relief softened her expression for just a moment. She shifted carefully until she was sitting on the lowest stone step beneath the castle entrance, using her own body to shield the small creature from the relentless wind. The cold continued creeping through every thread of her wedding gown, settling deep into her arms and legs until even simple movements required quiet determination. She could no longer feel the tips of her fingers, yet she gently brushed a few snowflakes away from the pup's ears with remarkable patience. "You are stronger than you know," she whispered. "Morning always comes, even after the longest night." The tiny wolf slowly opened one eye before nestling closer against her heartbeat, as though comforted by the calm certainty in her voice. Beyond the towering doors, music still drifted through the ancient stone walls, now softened into little more than distant echoes. The joyful celebration felt impossibly far away despite being only a few yards beyond the entrance. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the glowing windows. For a brief moment, she wondered whether anyone inside had remembered she was still waiting outside. The thought passed almost as quickly as it arrived. She chose not to dwell on disappointment. Her mother had often reminded her that resentment only made heavy burdens even harder to carry. Instead, Evelyn focused on the tiny life depending on her warmth. High above the courtyard, the silent observer remained standing beside the frost-covered window. The elderly scholar who had quietly entered the tower earlier watched beside him without speaking. Together they studied the young bride below. "She has not knocked once," the scholar observed. The figure beside him slowly shook his head. Nor has she cursed those who left her there. Another long silence followed before the scholar quietly added, "Many people reveal their character when they receive power. The rarest reveal it when they are denied kindness." Neither man looked away from the snowy courtyard. Far beyond Blackthorn Keep, nearly 50 miles south, powerful hooves thundered across a narrow mountain pass. Snow flew behind a black stallion as Alpha King Lucian Ashford urged the exhausted horse onward through the storm. His royal escort struggled to remain close behind, but Lucian barely noticed. Every passing mile strengthened the strange sensation tightening inside his chest. It was no ordinary worry. It felt as though an invisible thread stretched between him and someone waiting in desperate silence. He had experienced instinct many times before as a warrior and a king, but never anything quite like this. Earlier that day, he had left the wedding banquet only because duty demanded it. A border dispute between two neighboring packs had threatened to erupt into conflict, and, as king, he had chosen responsibility over celebration, believing he would return before midnight. Now an unfamiliar regret settled over him. He remembered the quiet grace with which Evelyn had greeted every servant at the ceremony, thanking people whose names most nobles never bothered learning. There had been no pride in her voice, no expectation of special treatment, only sincere appreciation. The memory refused to leave him. Suddenly his stallion slowed without command, ears standing alert toward the northern sky. Lucian pulled gently on the reins, surprised. His horse had never hesitated during a journey. Then the sharp pull inside his chest returned with startling force, stealing his breath for a single heartbeat before fading again. He lifted his eyes toward the distant outline of Blackthorn Keep, barely visible beyond the swirling snow. "Something is wrong," he said quietly. Without waiting for an answer, he urged his horse forward once more. Behind him, the royal guard exchanged uncertain glances before following as quickly as they could, unaware that every stride toward the castle was bringing their king closer to a truth that would change the kingdom forever. The strange pull inside Lucian's chest refused to fade. With every mile, the invisible bond grew stronger, no longer whispering but demanding to be heard. The mountain wind lashed against his dark cloak as his stallion climbed the final ridge overlooking Blackthorn Keep. From that height, the castle appeared peaceful beneath its blanket of snow, every tower glowing softly against the winter night. To anyone else, it would have looked like a kingdom at rest. To Lucian, something felt profoundly wrong. He raised one gloved hand, bringing the royal escort to a stop. The captain rode beside him, concern evident across his weathered face. "Your Majesty?" Lucian remained silent for a long moment, his silver eyes fixed on the distant fortress. Then the wind shifted. Along with the scent of pine and fresh snow came something else, delicate yet unmistakable. White lilies. Evelyn. Her scent was faint, almost disappearing beneath the storm, but it carried an icy sharpness that should never have been there. His wolf stirred instantly, not with anger, but with urgency. "Ride ahead," the captain offered. Lucian slowly shook his head. "No, stay together. We enter as one." Yet the moment the words left his mouth, another wave of pain tightened across his chest. He could almost feel the freezing air stealing warmth from someone far away. His hands tightened around the leather reins before he spoke again, this time with quiet certainty. "Faster." Without another word, the black stallion surged down the mountain trail, scattering fresh snow behind powerful hoofs. The royal escort followed as closely as they could, though none of them had ever seen their king push a horse this hard. Back at Blackthorn Keep, the storm had finally begun to ease, leaving behind an almost unsettling silence. Snow continued falling in lighter flakes, covering the courtyard until the stone paths had nearly vanished beneath smooth white drifts. Evelyn remained seated upon the lowest step, gently cradling the sleeping wolf pup beneath the folds of her gown. Her breathing had grown slower, each breath forming only a faint cloud before disappearing into the cold night. She brushed one last snowflake away from the little wolf's nose and smiled faintly when it twitched in its sleep. "You will see tomorrow," she whispered. "I think it will be beautiful." The tiny creature responded by nestling even closer against her heartbeat. High above, the elderly scholar quietly stepped away from the western tower window. "She has lasted longer than anyone expected," he murmured. The silent observer beside him remained motionless, eyes still fixed upon the courtyard below. "She has done more than endure," came the calm reply. "She has chosen compassion when comfort would have been easier to seek." The scholar slowly nodded. "Will you stop this?" Another long silence followed. At last the observer answered. "Someone already has." Almost at that very moment, the deep sound of iron gates opening echoed through the outer walls of Blackthorn Keep. Stable hands hurried across the entrance yard as the royal escort rode through the main gate, their horses breathing heavily after the relentless journey. Inside the banquet hall, several nobles looked toward the entrance in surprise as servants hurried to announce the unexpected arrival. Lady Vivian straightened her posture, quickly smoothing the folds of her elegant gown before stepping toward the great doors with practiced confidence. She expected a tired king returning from state business. Instead, the moment Lucian crossed the threshold, everyone nearest to him instinctively stepped aside. Snow still clung to his shoulders, but it was the expression in his silver eyes that silenced the hall. He did not acknowledge the music. He did not glance toward the feast. His gaze moved calmly across the room before settling on the council. "Where is my wife?" he asked. No one answered. The silence that followed was louder than any howl the mountains had ever carried. No one answered immediately. The music faded into an uneasy silence as every noble in the great hall slowly turned toward the Alpha King. Lucian stood perfectly still beneath the towering entrance, snow melting from the shoulders of his dark cloak onto the polished marble floor. His journey across the mountains had left traces of frost upon his boots. Yet the cold surrounding him did not come from winter. It came from the quiet certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. Lady Vivian stepped forward first, her graceful smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Your Majesty," she began carefully. "The council believed it appropriate for the new Luna to complete the trial of winter before joining the celebration." Lucian looked at her without changing expression. "The trial of winter?" His voice remained calm, almost gentle. The softness unsettled the room far more than anger would have. One elderly council member cleared his throat. "It has long been our custom. Every royal bride must demonstrate endurance before she is fully welcomed into the household." Lucian allowed several quiet seconds to pass before asking a single question. "Where is she?" No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. Lucian slowly turned his head toward the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall. He could still feel the invisible bond pulling at his heart, stronger now than it had been anywhere along the mountain road. It was no longer only concern. His instincts told him Evelyn was close enough that he could almost reach her. Without another word, he walked toward the entrance. Several royal guards instinctively stepped forward to accompany him, but Lucian lifted one hand. "Remain here." The command was quiet, yet absolute. The enormous doors swung open with a deep groan, allowing a rush of icy air to sweep through the hall. Candles flickered. Guests instinctively pulled their cloaks tighter around themselves. Beyond the entrance stretched a courtyard buried beneath fresh snow, peaceful at first glance, almost untouched by the storm. Lucian's silver eyes searched the white landscape only for a heartbeat before they found her. Evelyn sat upon the lowest stone step exactly where they had left her. Snow rested gently across her pale hair and along the folds of her wedding gown. Her head leaned lightly against the cold stone wall, and both arms remained wrapped protectively around the tiny silver wolf sleeping peacefully beneath the fabric. Even after everything she had endured, her first instinct had been to keep another living creature warm. Lucian crossed the courtyard without hesitation. The deep snow barely slowed his stride. Every step shortened the distance between them until he finally knelt beside her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her face. Despite the exhaustion written across her features, there was remarkable peace there. She had not surrendered to bitterness. Carefully, he brushed a few snowflakes from her hair with the back of his gloved hand. Evelyn's eyelashes fluttered. Slowly she opened her eyes, blinking against the pale morning light reflected by the snow. It took her a moment to recognize him. Then, instead of asking why she had been left outside or whether anyone would be punished, she looked down at the little wolf and spoke in a voice barely stronger than the wind itself. "It finally stopped shaking," she whispered. "I think it will be all right now." Lucian lowered his eyes toward the sleeping pup before looking back at Evelyn. In that quiet moment, something inside him changed forever. Strength had built his kingdom. Duty had shaped his life. But the woman before him possessed a different kind of greatness, one that neither crowns nor traditions could create. Without saying another word, he unclasped the heavy royal cloak from his shoulders and gently wrapped it around Evelyn and the little wolf together. Then, with effortless care, he lifted them both into his arms. As he turned toward the castle, every person watching from the doorway lowered their eyes, realizing that the greatest lesson of the night had never belonged to the bride standing in the snow, but to everyone who had remained warm while she quietly chose compassion instead. Lucian carried Evelyn through the great doors without slowing his pace, the heavy royal cloak wrapped securely around both her and the tiny silver wolf sleeping peacefully against her. The warmth of the banquet hall rushed toward them, carrying the scent of cedar fires and fresh bread, yet no one moved. Hundreds of eyes followed the Alpha King in complete silence as he crossed the polished marble floor. The laughter that had filled the castle only moments earlier had disappeared, replaced by an uneasy stillness that seemed to reach every corner of Blackthorn Keep. Lucian did not glance toward the council. He did not acknowledge the nobles standing along the walls. His attention never left the exhausted woman resting in his arms. Snow melted slowly from the edge of his cloak, leaving a trail of glistening droplets behind him. Near the grand staircase, the royal physician hurried forward with several attendants carrying thick wool blankets, steaming water, and a leather medical case. "The eastern chamber is ready, Your Majesty," the physician said respectfully. Lucian gave a brief nod. "Keep the fireplaces burning. Bring warm broth, not wine. She needs warmth gradually." "At once, Your Majesty." Minutes later, the heavy oak door of the private royal chamber closed softly behind them, shutting out the whispers spreading through the castle. 3 stone fireplaces filled the room with gentle heat, and fragrant cedar logs crackled steadily beneath golden flames. Lucian carefully lowered Evelyn onto a cushioned chair placed beside the largest hearth while the physician quietly examined her chilled hands and checked her breathing. "She is exhausted," the physician said after a careful moment. But thankfully, she remained moving for much of the night. That likely prevented the cold from becoming far more dangerous. She should rest before speaking very much. Lucian simply nodded. A maid approached with a basket lined in soft blankets for the little wolf. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes as the physician finished his examination. Still weak from the long night, she looked immediately toward the tiny creature resting beneath the royal cloak. "May I?" the maid asked gently. Evelyn smiled faintly before carefully placing the sleeping wolf into the waiting basket. The little animal stretched once, circled the blankets, and settled comfortably with a peaceful sigh. Only after seeing it safely asleep did Evelyn finally allow herself to lean back against the chair. Nearly an hour passed in quiet stillness. The warmth of the room gradually returned feeling to her hands while the physician checked on her several more times. Lucian remained nearby without interrupting her rest, seated across from the fire with silent patience. He had spent years making difficult decisions for an entire kingdom, yet somehow waiting beside one sleeping woman demanded a different kind of strength. At last Evelyn stirred, blinking slowly as the morning light filtered through the tall windows. Lucian rose and poured a cup of warm herbal tea before placing it gently into her hands. "Drink slowly," he said. His voice carried none of the commanding authority heard in the great hall, only calm reassurance. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the warm cup, grateful for its comforting heat. After taking a few careful sips, she glanced toward the basket where the little wolf slept peacefully. "Has it eaten?" she asked softly. The physician smiled with quiet admiration. "Yes, Your Majesty. It has been fed and is resting comfortably." Evelyn released a small breath of relief before closing her eyes for just a moment. Watching her, Lucian realized that after an entire night in the snow, after being forgotten by nearly everyone, inside the castle, her very first concern was still for another living creature. Not once had she complained about the cold. Not once had she spoken bitterly about those who had abandoned her. Compassion seemed to come as naturally to her as breathing itself. Just then the little wolf lifted its head inside the basket. A faint silver glow shimmered softly through its fur before fading almost as quickly as it appeared. This time Lucian saw the light clearly. The physician noticed it as well, exchanging a surprised glance with the elderly scholar who had quietly entered the chamber moments earlier. The old man smiled knowingly as he watched the tiny creature curl peacefully back into its blankets. Some gifts, he said in a thoughtful voice, only reveal themselves to hearts that choose kindness before comfort. And your majesty, I believe your kingdom has just welcomed far more than a new Luna. When the first light of morning spread across Blackthorn Keep, Lucian found himself standing beside the chamber window, watching fresh snow slide quietly from the castle rooftops. Behind him, the fireplaces still burned steadily, filling the room with gentle warmth. Evelyn remained asleep beneath thick blankets, her breathing calm, and even after nearly an hour of uninterrupted rest, the little guardian wolf rested peacefully inside its basket near the hearth, the faint silver glow from the previous night lingering only as a memory. Lucian glanced toward the tiny creature once more before leaving the chamber. The image of its mysterious light remained fixed in his thoughts, raising questions he intended to answer later. For now, another matter demanded his attention. By the time he entered the great council hall, every senior noble, council elder, and royal official had already assembled beneath the towering stone arches. No conversations echoed through the chamber. Everyone knew why they had been summoned. Lucian walked to the center of the hall without ceremony. He wore a simple black coat instead of royal robes, making his quiet authority seem even greater. His silver eyes slowly moved across the gathered faces before he spoke. I have one question. His voice was steady, neither loud nor harsh, yet every word carried effortlessly across the silent chamber. Who saw Evelyn outside last night? No one answered. Several nobles lowered their eyes while others exchanged uncertain glances. Lucian waited patiently. The silence stretched long enough for every person in the room to hear the crackling fireplaces along the walls. Finally, the young servant who had hesitated beside the entrance the previous evening stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he bowed. I saw her, Your Majesty. Lucian nodded once. Did you want to help her? Yes, Your Majesty. Why did you not? The servant swallowed before answering honestly. I was told that opening the doors would violate the council's orders. Lucian's gaze slowly followed the servant's eyes until they rested upon Lady Vivian Blackwood. She remained composed as she stepped forward. The trial of winter has guided our royal household for generations, she said with measured confidence. Every Luna has been expected to prove her resilience before receiving the full honor of the crown. Before Lucian could respond, the elderly scholar quietly rose from his seat. With respect, he said, that is not how the tradition began. Every eye turned toward him. The old man folded his hands behind his back. The original trial of winter lasted only long enough for a bride and her mate to greet the season together before entering the castle side by side. It symbolized leaving behind the old life and beginning the new one together. It was never intended to leave a bride alone through the night. A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber. Several older council members looked genuinely unsettled, quietly realizing they had inherited a custom that had gradually lost its original meaning. The scholar continued. Over the years, ceremony became pride. Pride became expectation. Eventually, no one remembered the difference. Lucian remained silent for another moment before speaking. Traditions exist to preserve wisdom. His eyes swept across the hall. The moment they stop protecting people, they stop honoring the values they were created to defend. No accusation followed. No. Punishment was announced. Somehow that restraint weighed more heavily upon the room than anger ever could have. At that moment, the great doors opened softly. Evelyn stepped inside wearing a simple cream-colored dress, her color fully restored after several hours of rest. The little guardian wolf walked quietly beside her instead of hiding in her arms, its small silver paws making almost no sound against the polished floor. Every head turned toward her. She noticed the frightened young servant standing near the entrance and walked directly to him. The young man immediately lowered his head, ashamed that he had done nothing the night before. Evelyn offered him a warm, reassuring smile. Thank you, she said gently. The servant looked up in confusion. For what, Your Majesty? Evelyn answered without hesitation. For wishing you had the courage to help. Sometimes the heart arrives before the strength does. Do not lose either. Her simple words settled over the chamber more deeply than any judgment ever could, and in that quiet moment, many within the great council realized they were no longer looking at a woman learning how to become their Luna. They were already standing in the presence of one. The chamber remained silent long after Evelyn's words faded into the air. The young servant stood motionless, his eyes glistening with gratitude as though a burden he had carried all night had finally become lighter. Around him, several nobles quietly lowered their heads. They had expected their new Luna to demand justice, to expose every mistake made against her, or at the very least to remind everyone how deeply she had been wronged. Instead, she had offered understanding to the one person who had lacked the courage to act. Lucian watched the exchange without speaking. Over the years, he had learned that fear often controlled people more effectively than loyalty. Yet standing before him was a woman who inspired something entirely different. She awakened conscience. That realization settled more deeply within him than any victory won on a battlefield. The elderly scholar slowly stepped forward once more. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "before this meeting ends, there are a few things I believe you should hear." Lucian nodded. "Speak freely." The old man turned toward the gathered servants. "Tell His Majesty what you have witnessed since Lady Evelyn first arrived yesterday." For a brief moment no one moved. Then the head cook stepped forward, twisting the corner of her apron nervously. "Yesterday morning, one of the kitchen girls burned her hand while taking bread from the oven," she said. "Lady Evelyn found her crying behind the pantry. She finished preparing the bread herself so the girl would not lose her position on such an important day." The young kitchen maid immediately shook her head. She never told anyone she had done it. Before the surprise could settle, the stable master quietly cleared his throat. When the royal carriage arrived, one of the horses had become frightened after the long mountain journey. While everyone else hurried toward the ceremony, Lady Evelyn stayed behind with one of the stable boys until the animal finally calmed down. The stable boy smiled shyly. "She thanked me for taking care of the king's horses. No noble has ever thanked me before." A gardener stepped forward next. "She helped me carry baskets of winter herbs into the greenhouse because she noticed my back was hurting." Then a laundry maid spoke. "She remembered my name after hearing it only once." Another servant added, "She shared her lunch with 2 children waiting outside the south gate because they looked hungry." One story quietly followed another. None of them involved grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. They were ordinary moments, almost invisible acts of kindness that had seemed too small to matter until someone finally asked about them. Lucian listened without interrupting. Each memory revealed another piece of the woman he had barely known before their wedding. He realized that Evelyn had earned the affection of the people around her long before she had ever worn the title of Luna. Across the chamber, the little guardian wolf wandered calmly beside Evelyn before stopping near the center of the polished floor. It lifted its head toward the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Without warning, a soft silver glow spread gently through its fur, brighter than anyone had seen before. Tiny ribbons of shimmering light drifted through the air like floating snowflakes before disappearing around Evelyn. A quiet gasp moved through the hall. The elderly scholar smiled with unmistakable recognition. "The old chronicles were true," he whispered. "Guardian wolves never choose power. They choose character." The little wolf walked back to Evelyn and gently rested one small paw against her hand. The silver light faded almost instantly, leaving only peaceful morning sunlight behind. Lucian looked from the tiny creature to Evelyn, and in that silent moment, he understood something no council, no tradition, and no royal decree could ever determine. A kingdom could appoint a queen, but only her heart could make her worthy of being remembered for generations. Sunlight poured through the towering windows of Blackthorn Keep, scattering across the polished marble floor where countless generations of rulers had once stood. Yet on that winter morning, the ancient hall felt different. The weight of old customs had begun to lift, replaced by a quiet sense that something new had taken root. The little guardian wolf remained beside Evelyn, its golden eyes calm as it looked from her to Lucian, as though patiently waiting for the final choice only a king could make. Lucian stepped forward until he stood beside Evelyn beneath the warm light streaming through the windows. For several silent moments, he simply looked at her. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had arrived as a political bride, a woman chosen to unite noble houses and strengthen the kingdom. Since then, he had watched her comfort a frightened animal while she herself trembled in the snow. He had watched her forgive those who had failed her without asking for recognition. He had listened as servants, stable hands, gardeners, and cooks spoke of quiet acts of kindness she had never mentioned herself. Strength had protected his kingdom for many years, but standing beside Evelyn, Lucian understood that compassion protected something even greater. Slowly, he unclasped the royal mantle from his shoulders. Woven from deep midnight blue, velvet and embroidered with silver threads representing every united pack of the Northern Kingdom, it was worn only during the kingdom's most sacred ceremonies. Every person in the hall watched as he carefully placed the mantle around Evelyn's shoulders. The heavy fabric settled gently across her, replacing the memory of the freezing night with warmth that belonged to her at last. Evelyn looked up, surprised, meeting Lucian's steady gaze. A faint smile appeared in his eyes before he turned toward the assembled council. "From this day forward," he said, his calm voice carrying through the silent hall, "no tradition within this kingdom will ever ask compassion to stand outside while pride remains by the fire." No one interrupted. Customs exist to remind us who we are. The moment they forget mercy, they no longer deserve to lead us. His eyes rested briefly upon the young servant who had spoken honestly that morning. May every person who serves this kingdom remember that courage is not only found in battle. Sometimes it begins with opening a door. The words settled over the chamber like the first warmth of spring. Lady Vivian stepped forward, her usual confidence replaced by genuine humility. She bowed deeply before Evelyn. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I believed endurance alone created a worthy queen. Last night taught me that kindness endures far longer than pride. Please accept my sincere apology." Evelyn stepped closer before gently offering her hand. "Then let yesterday become the last night anyone is left alone in the cold." Lady Vivian accepted her hand with quiet gratitude. Around the hall, the tension that had gripped the castle since dawn finally began to dissolve. The little guardian wolf suddenly trotted toward the great entrance as the enormous oak doors slowly opened. Bright winter sunlight spilled across the stone floor, reaching the very place where cold wind had entered only hours before. Outside, tiny drops of melting snow slipped from rooftops, sparkling like scattered diamonds beneath the morning sky. The little wolf paused at the threshold, looked back at Evelyn one final time, then lifted its head toward the mountains. A gentle, silver light surrounded its small body before quietly drifting into the crisp winter air, disappearing among the pine trees as though the mountain itself had welcomed it home. The elderly scholar smiled, his eyes following the fading light. "The guardian has finished its work," he whispered. "It did not come to test the kingdom. It came to reveal the heart that was already worthy." Lucian reached for Evelyn's hand, and together they stepped through the open doors into the clear morning light. Around them, servants greeted one another with warmer smiles. The heavy entrance remained wide open, and children laughed as they ran across the courtyard where untouched snow had begun to melt beneath the rising sun. Long after that winter had passed, people across the Northern Kingdom continued telling the story of the gentle Luna, who never demanded justice for herself, yet inspired an entire kingdom to become kinder, because they discovered that the strongest ruler is not always the one who commands the greatest power, but the one whose compassion quietly changes every heart willing to receive it. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.